"Dad, your car is on fire!" The sentence came from my son Matthew's mouth, with a coldness that froze the early morning air, a tone devoid of panic or urgency, almost as if he were announcing the start of a rain shower. Standing there in my bedroom doorway, the hallway light casting his slender silhouette, he didn't look like my son, but a stranger, a messenger of a calamity he had orchestrated himself. In that instant, the acrid smell of smoke and burnt rubber invaded my nostrils, confirming his words. My Mercedes-Benz 280 SL, a jewel I spent years restoring, my passion and my pride, was being consumed by flames in my own driveway. And the arsonist was my own blood, the boy to whom I had given everything. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Arthur Vance, a 68-year-old man who dedicated his life to civil engineering. I built a construction company from the ground up that became a respected name in the market, a legacy of cement and steel that I sold a few years ago to enjoy a quiet, well-deserved retirement. I have always been a man of logic, of calculations and plans. My life was built on the premise that effort yields results, and integrity is the foundation of everything. I raised my son, Matthew, alone after my wife passed away, and I strove to give him not only the material comfort I never had, but also the values that guided me. However, somewhere along the way, my generosity was mistaken for weakness, and my love for an inexhaustible obligation. My relationship with Matthew had turned into a silent transaction in recent years, especially since Sophia, his girlfriend, came into the picture. At 28 years old, with a chronic refusal to take on responsibility, he saw me as an infinite ATM, a source of funds for a lifestyle he made no effort to earn. Every denied request was met with a look of contempt. Every no was a personal affront to his sense of entitlement. I financed his endless studies, his cars, his trips, always hoping that one day he would find his own way. But his gratitude was fleeting, a poorly executed disguise for his next demand. That Friday night, the tension was a thick fog in the living room. I was in my leather armchair, trying to concentrate on a history book, while Matthew and Sophia watched some random show on television, the volume unnecessarily high. Their presence in my home had ceased to be a comfort and had become a burden. Sophia's smiles were transparent, masks for a greed she barely bothered to hide, and Matthew's impatience was almost a vibration in the air. He wanted the keys to my classic Mercedes, the 280 SL, to, in his words, impress some friends over the weekend. It was an absurd request, not because of the car's value, but for the disrespect it represented. My refusal was calm but final. A simple, "No, Matthew," was enough to ignite the fury in his eyes. He didn't argue, he didn't shout. Instead, he shot a look at Sophia, a complicit glance that communicated a plan, a promise of retaliation. I watched them over my reading glasses, feeling a profound weariness. That exchange of glances was the confirmation of everything I had suspected for over a year. To them, I was not a father or a host, but an obstacle, a stubborn old man who refused to hand over what they believed was theirs by right. Deceit had become the official language in that house, and I was fluent in it. Hours later, the sound of his voice at my door sealed the fate of our relationship. "Dad, your car is on fire!" There was no shock in my reaction, only a frigid resignation. As I walked down the stairs, the orange glow of the flames danced in the living room windows, painting scenes of destruction on the walls where photos of a happy family once hung. Outside, the Mercedes was a funeral pyre. The heat was intense, and the sound of twisting metal was like a scream of agony. Matthew stood at a safe distance, arms crossed, a look of feigned concern on his face. Sophia was behind him, her hand covering her mouth in a poorly rehearsed gesture of shock. They expected me to fall apart, to scream, to cry. They expected to see me broken by the loss of something I loved. But instead, a supernatural calm came over me, because that act of vandalism, that display of pure malice, was not the beginning of my pain, but the end of my doubt. It was the final proof, the missing piece in the complex puzzle I had been secretly assembling. They didn't know it, but that bonfire wasn't destroying my spirit. It was illuminating the path I would have to follow, a path of cold, calculated consequences. As the firefighters arrived and the red and blue lights swept across the darkness, I watched my son give his statement to the police. He spoke of a possible short circuit, weaving a lie with the confidence of a sociopath. He felt victorious, believing he had taught me a lesson about the cost of denying his whims. He glanced in my direction, a glint of triumph in his eyes, expecting to see a defeated man. But what he saw was his father, Arthur Vance, the engineer, the builder, looking at the ruins of his beloved car, not with sadness, but with the precision of someone analyzing a demolition blueprint. The car was just metal and paint. The real value was in the lesson its destruction would provide. Matthew and Sophia had just lit the fuse, with no idea that the explosive charge was planted right under their own feet. They thought they had destroyed a relic of the past, when, in reality, they had just sealed their future. That fire was not an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of the end of the life of lies and parasitism they had built at my expense. The night ended with the smoldering shell of the Mercedes being covered by a tarp. The police were polite, but skeptical of the short-circuit story. I thanked everyone and went back inside. Matthew and Sophia had already retired, probably celebrating their small victory. I sat in my armchair in the now silent living room and allowed myself to feel the weight of what had happened. It wasn't the loss of the car that hurt, but the confirmation of my son's nature. The betrayal was absolute, and my response, I swore in those early hours, would be equally absolute. The plan, which until then had been a contingency, a safety net woven in the shadow of my suspicions, was now activated. Every subsequent step had already been meticulously planned. There would be no shouting, no emotional confrontations. My revenge would not be hot and impulsive, like the fire they started. It would be cold, methodical, and inevitable, like justice that moves slowly but crushes everything in its path. They wanted my assets while I was still alive? Well, they were about to learn, the hard way, the true cost of every cent I had earned with sweat and honesty. The day after the fire, a heavy silence hung over the house, thick with unspoken words. Matthew and Sophia moved around me with studied caution, waiting for an explosion that never came. They expected shouts, accusations, tears. Instead, they found me at the kitchen table, calmly drinking my coffee and reading the newspaper as if it were any other Saturday. My calmness was their torture. I could see the confusion in their eyes whenever they looked at me. The lack of a dramatic reaction disarmed them, left them without a script. They couldn't understand that my pain didn't manifest as rage, but as an icy clarity, a resolve that solidified with each passing minute. My mind, trained by decades of engineering, didn't see a family drama, but a structural problem that required a controlled demolition. My decision wasn't made in the heat of the moment. It was the activation of an emergency protocol my intuition had led me to create over a year ago. Their betrayal didn't surprise me. It only gave me the final justification to act. While they whispered in the living room, probably conspiring about how they would deal with the senile old man, I retreated to my office. My first act was not to call the insurance company, but Dr. Evans, my lawyer and confidant for over 30 years. "Good morning, Alan," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "The time has come to open the folder we prepared. The catalyst event occurred last night. I'll send you the files within the hour. On the other end of the line, there was no surprise, only a calm, "Understood, Arthur. I'll be waiting." The action plan was already mapped out in minute detail, a social engineering project I had designed with the same precision I used for bridges and buildings. The first phase was the consolidation of irrefutable evidence. I turned on my computer and accessed the cloud storage, where the recordings from the 4K security cameras were safely stored. There were 4 different angles of the driveway, discrete, heat-proof cameras I had installed myself. The image quality was frighteningly sharp, capturing every detail of that fateful night with forensic clarity. As the files transferred to an encrypted drive for my lawyer, I felt the weight of that digital proof. It was the truth in pixels, the silent weapon of my justice. The next step was to assemble the financial dossier. For months, I had been a meticulous archivist of my son's moral decay. Every statement from the supplementary credit card I'd given him, every bank transfer labeled school support or household expenses, was documented and organized into folders. I saved copies of text messages where his demands became increasingly aggressive, his lies more and more shameless. This wasn't the act of a grievance collector, but of an investigator building a case. Each document was a brick in the wall that would soon rise around them. A wall built with their own greed and dishonesty. Reviewing the videos with Dr. Evans in his office later that day, the visual impact was even more powerful than the reality. We watched Matthew, my son, tiptoeing toward the car, his face contorted into a mask of rage and resentment. We saw Sophia at the garage door, not as a passive participant, but as a lookout, a beacon of encouragement for his destruction. The audio camera picked up their whispers. "Are you sure about this, babe?" she asked, not with concern, but with a complicit excitement. "He needs to learn," Matthew replied, his voice a hiss before unscrewing the cap of the gasoline can. That dialogue was their sentence. The systematic dismantling of their facade of innocence was in full swing. While the visual proof of the arson was the centerpiece, the financial investigation revealed that the fire was merely a symptom of a much deeper disease. An analysis of Matthew's credit card statements revealed a pattern of cash withdrawals at ATMs near underground casinos, confirming my suspicions of a gambling addiction he had vehemently denied. The amounts were substantial, explaining his constant desperate need for more money. He wasn't financing a lifestyle. He was feeding a demon that was consuming him from within. Sophia's expenses were equally telling. With the money I gave my son for his future, she was building a present of luxury for herself. Weekend trips to expensive resorts, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and a collection of designer bags and shoes that would make a celebrity envious. These were purchases made without shame, an open celebration of her success in manipulating my son and, by extension, me. Every receipt was an insult, proof of her parasitic nature. They weren't a couple in love. They were a 2-person criminal enterprise, and I was the sole investor. The most painful discovery came from a set of emails my lawyer managed to recover, exchanged between them on an account they thought was secret. In them, they spoke openly about my health, speculating on my life expectancy and planning how they would manage the inheritance. They referred to me as the old man, the obstacle, the spigot. The cruelty of their words, written in the privacy of what they believed was a safe space, was like a knife in my heart. The betrayal wasn't just financial or material. It was a complete and utter annihilation of filial love and respect. The car fire was just their way of trying to speed up the process. With all the evidence gathered, Dr. Evans and I spent the next 2 days preparing for the final confrontation. This wouldn't be a family court. It would be a presentation of cold, indisputable facts. My lawyer prepared the legal aspects, outlining the criminal consequences they faced: arson, fraud, conspiracy. The prison sentences were long, with no possibility of bail, given the premeditated nature of the crime. Our strategy wasn't to threaten, but to present a clear and unavoidable choice between 2 radically different futures. One path led to prison, the other to forced redemption. My role in this process was to maintain my composure. During those 2 days, I continued my routine at home. I greeted Matthew and Sophia in the morning, sharing silent meals with them. My normality was their greatest source of anxiety. They didn't know what to expect. Their initial arrogance began to give way to a palpable nervousness. They saw me talking on the phone in my office, closing the door with deliberate calm, and their imaginations no doubt ran wild. I was letting them stew in their own poison, increasing the psychological pressure before the final blow. The execution of the plan required a fitting stage, a neutral ground where I held all the power. Dr. Evans's conference room was perfect, impersonal, formal, and equipped with the necessary technology for our presentation. We set the meeting for Tuesday morning, 3 days after the crime. The pretext was infallible, bait they would take without hesitation. I was finally going to discuss the insurance procedures for the car, a matter that to them meant money. Greed would be their downfall, leading them willingly into the trap. The night before the meeting, I approached them in the living room. "Matthew, Sophia," I began, my tone perfectly neutral. "Tomorrow morning at 10, I have a meeting with my lawyer to go over the insurance paperwork. I'd like you both to come with me. Since you were present, your testimony might be necessary." I saw the relief on their faces, the exchange of smug glances. In their minds, they had fooled me. They were on their way to capitalizing on their own destruction. "Of course, Dad, we'll be there," Matthew said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They had no idea they weren't going to testify for an insurance company, but for their own judgment. My calmness was not an absence of feeling. On the contrary, it was a dam built to hold back an ocean of pain and disillusionment. Every calculated step, every piece of evidence gathered, was a way to channel that pain toward a constructive purpose. This wasn't about revenge in its crudest sense, but about justice in its purest. It was about imposing consequences, about forcing accountability upon a son who had never known it. It was about rebalancing the scales they had so contemptuously tipped. While they prepared for the meeting, picking out their best clothes to impress the lawyer, I was already visualizing the scene. The large screen descending from the ceiling, the click of Dr. Evans's mouse starting the video, the crystal clear sound of their voices filling the silent room, the transformation on their faces, from shock to denial and finally to abject panic. I felt no pleasure in this image, only a sense of grim necessity. It was a painful surgery, but essential to remove the cancer of dishonesty that had metastasized in my family. My plan sought not only to punish them, but also to protect what was left of my legacy. By transferring my main assets into a trust fund with extremely rigid behavioral clauses, I had ensured that my fortune would be used for productive purposes, not to fuel vices and empty luxuries. The beneficiary would have to demonstrate character, work, and integrity, qualities my son had long since abandoned. My wealth would cease to be a crutch for him and would instead become a mirror reflecting his own failings. The dismantling was not just of their web of lies, but also of their self-image. Matthew saw himself as a potential wolf of Wall Street, a misunderstood genius who deserved the world. Sophia saw herself as a queen, destined for a life of opulence. My strategy aimed to strip them of these illusions, forcing them to confront the raw, naked reality of who they truly were. A debt-ridden gambler and a gold-digging manipulator. The truth would be their sentence and, perhaps, their only hope of salvation. As we got into the car that Tuesday morning, with them sitting in the back seat, chattering excitedly about their plans, I was the personification of the calm before. The arrival at the imposing downtown office building marked the end of their illusion. The austere atmosphere, the smell of polished wood and law books, all contributed to the solemnity of the moment. They didn't know it yet, but they were entering a place where their charm and lies held no value. They were entering the world of logic, evidence, and consequences. My world. And in that world, I was the architect, and they were about to discover that the foundations of their life were made of sand. Dr. Evans received us with a professional cordiality that masked the coming storm. He led us to the conference room, a spacious area with a long mahogany table and a huge screen on the wall. "Then please have a seat," he said, his tone leaving no room for small talk. Matthew and Sophia sat down, still with an air of expectation, as if they were about to receive good news. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. They looked at the blank screen, not knowing it would soon project their own dark souls for all to see. I sat at the head of the table, facing them. For a brief moment our eyes met. In my son's gaze, I saw the same impatience as always, the same sense of entitlement. He wanted this to be over so he could go get his money. In my gaze, I hope he saw something different. Not anger, not sadness, just the end. The end of the deception, the end of his prolonged childhood, the end of my patience. The project was complete. The demolition phase was about to begin. As my lawyer turned on the projector, a tense silence filled the room. The soft whir of the machine's fan was the only sound. I leaned forward slightly, my hands clasped on the table. My part in the plan was almost done. I had gathered the materials, designed the blueprint, and supervised the construction of the trap. Now all that was left was to watch the truth do its work, systematically dismantling the rotten structure they had built on the foundation of my love. The projector light flickered, and an image appeared on the screen. It wasn't an insurance document or a form to be filled out. It was a crystal-clear image of my driveway, seen from above, in the dead of night. The date and time were stamped in the bottom corner. I saw Matthew's shoulders tense. Sophia held her breath. The movie was about to begin, and they were the unfortunate stars of their own horror film. The upheaval I had planned was complete. What would follow was not revenge, but consequences. The click of Dr. Evans's mouse was the only sound in the room, a small noise with the power to demolish worlds. The image on the screen came to life. There was Matthew, my son, his figure bathed in the cold light of the garage security lamps. Every movement was sharp, every gesture deliberate. The uncoiling of the hose from the can, the dark liquid soaking the hood and roof of the Mercedes, the metallic glint of the lighter in his hand. I saw Sophia's face, framed in the doorway, a mixture of fear and excitement. Then the spark. The eruption of flames was sudden and violent, and I saw my son take a step back, not with remorse, but with a perverse admiration for his own destructive work. The video continued in silence for another minute, showing the fire consuming the car before the screen went black. The awakening to disaster was a silent, terrible spectacle. The blood drained from Matthew's face, leaving his skin a waxy pale. His eyes, once full of arrogance, were now wide with pure terror, fixed on the dark screen as if he could still see the ghost of the flames. Beside him, Sophia made a choke sound, a sob that died in her throat. She brought a hand to her mouth, her perfectly painted nails trembling against her pale lips. The reality of what they had done, and more importantly of being caught so irrefutably, crashed down on them like a concrete slab. The air in the room grew thin, heavy with their exposed guilt. The silence was broken by the calm, methodical voice of Dr. Evans. "This," he said, gesturing to the screen, "is an indictment for aggravated arson, carrying a prison sentence of 3 to 6 years, with no possibility of bail. But that's just the beginning." With another click, the screen lit up again, this time with a spreadsheet. It was Matthew's credit card statements. My lawyer began to narrate, line by line, the exorbitant expenses, the suspicious cash withdrawals, the stays at luxury hotels he could never afford. Each transaction was a hammer blow to the facade my son had built. His life of lies was being dissected in a cold corporate slideshow. Matthew's humiliation was palpable. He shrank in his chair, his once relaxed body now taut as a wire. He tried to avoid my gaze, but I kept my eyes fixed on him, not with anger, but with a surgical sadness. I wanted him to see that I was witnessing his downfall, not as a vengeful spectator, but as the architect of his necessary confrontation with the truth. Next came Sophia's purchases, an endless list of luxury items, each bought with my money, each a symbol of her greed. She stared at the screen as if seeing the ghost of a life that had just evaporated before her eyes. Finally, Dr. Evans projected the emails. The cruel words, the old man, the spigot appeared in large black letters on the screen. That was the final blow. Sophia began to cry openly, not tears of remorse, but of self-pity. Matthew, for his part, seemed to have run out of air. His world, built on the shifting sands of dishonesty and contempt, was crumbling in real time, and he was being buried under the rubble. His arrogance, his entitlement, it all dissolved, replaced by the pure panic of a cornered animal. It was then that I spoke for the first time. My voice sounded strangely calm in the tense room. "There are two paths before you," I said, looking directly at Matthew. "The first path is simple. Dr. Evans hands this entire dossier over to the police this afternoon. You will both face criminal charges. You will go to jail. Your future as you know it ends today." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "The second path is mine. You accept my conditions, all of them, here and now, without negotiation. You sign the documents my lawyer has prepared, and you begin to face the consequences of your actions outside of a cell." Matthew opened his mouth to protest, perhaps out of pure reflex. "Dad, We can explain." His voice was weak, a pathetic whisper. Dr. Evans cut him off coldly. "There's nothing to explain, Matthew. The evidence is absolute. Any words you say now can and will be used against you. The only decision you have to make is between the front door of this building or the door of a police station." The finality in my lawyer's voice extinguished the last spark of resistance in Matthew. He looked at Sophia, seeking support, seeking an escape. But what he found was the beginning of his total isolation. Sophia, realizing the ship was sinking fast, went into survival mode. Her loyalty to Matthew evaporated instantly. She turned to him, her eyes burning with a cold fury. This was all your fault!" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You said everything was under control. You said your father was a foolish old man who would never find out. You've ruined my life." The speed with which she threw him to the wolves was breathtaking. She no longer saw him as a partner, but as the one responsible for the catastrophe now engulfing her. Their complicity transformed into accusation in a matter of seconds. The rupture of their bond was brutal and final, right there in front of me. "I'm not going to jail because of you," she continued, now addressing my lawyer. "I didn't set anything on fire. I was there, but he forced me. I'm a victim in all this." It was a desperate and despicable performance. Dr. Evans, unfazed, simply pushed a document in her direction. "Miss Sophia, my client is willing to not press charges against you for complicity on the condition that you sign this agreement. In it, you agree to cease all contact with the Vance family permanently. Any attempt at contact will result in an immediate restraining order and the reopening of your case." Without a second's hesitation, Sophia grabbed the pen and signed the document with a trembling hand. She didn't look at Matthew once. The man with whom she had planned a future of luxury was now just collateral damage in her scramble for self-preservation. She stood up, smoothed her expensive clothes, and walked to the door without a word. As she passed Matthew, she shot him a look of pure contempt. The door clicked shut behind her, and with that click, Matthew was left utterly alone, abandoned by his accomplice and confronted by the cold consequence of his own betrayal. My son stared at the closed door, his expression a mask of shock and abandonment. The loss of his status, his freedom, and his future was already an overwhelming blow, but being discarded so clinically by the woman he loved seemed to break him on a much deeper level. He hung his head, and for the first time I saw something resembling true despair in his slumped shoulders. He had lost everything he valued: the money, the power to manipulate, and the admiration of his partner in crime. His fall was swift, public, and total. The rest of the meeting was a grim formality. Matthew, now docile and defeated, signed everything that was put in front of him. He signed the agreement evicting him from my house. He signed the legal document obligating him to repay the trust fund the full value of the car, $150,000, threw a lien on all his future earnings. He signed the commitment to begin mandatory anger management therapy and psychological counseling, the reports of which would be sent to Dr. Evans. He was signing his own sentence, a life of forced work and rehabilitation. The ride home was conducted in sepulchral silence. I drove, my eyes fixed on the road. Matthew was in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his figure shrunken. The arrogant, demanding young man who had sat in that car a few hours earlier had vanished, replaced by a broken man, a stranger. When we arrived, I parked in the driveway, in the exact spot where the Mercedes had burned. The black stain on the concrete was a permanent memorial to his crime, a scar he would now have to face every day. "You have 1 hour," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Get your personal belongings. Only the essentials. Clothes and your documents. Nothing else." He didn't protest. He walked up the stairs slowly, like an old man. I watched him from the ground floor, making sure he didn't take anything that had been bought with my money. The giant screen TV, the video game console, the high-end computer, everything he considered his would remain. They were symbols of the life he had lost, and now they would serve as a constant reminder of his absence. Watching him come down the stairs with a single suitcase was one of the most difficult moments of my life. On one hand, my father's heart ached to see my son in such a state of humiliation. On the other, my rational mind knew this was the only possible cure for the disease that consumed him. It was tough love, a love that had to destroy in order to perhaps one day rebuild. He stopped in front of me and handed over the house keys, his other car keys, and the credit cards. His hands were trembling. "Where am I going to go?" he asked, his voice a thread. "That, Matthew," I replied calmly, "is the first problem you'll have to solve for yourself." The door closed behind him, and the house fell into a silence that was, for the first time in a long time, peaceful. The weight of his toxic presence had been lifted. In the days that followed, I began to hear, through indirect sources, of his growing isolation. His first call was to Sophia. She didn't answer. His messages were blocked. His first and most important ally had erased him from her life as if he had never existed. An inconvenient footnote in her story. Next, he sought out his friends, the entourage of sycophants who surrounded him when he was paying the bills. He called one, asking to crash on his couch for a few nights. The excuse was vague, trouble at home. But news, especially bad news, travels fast. The friend made a lame excuse about his parents visiting. The door was closed in his face. He tried another and then another. The responses were always the same. Polite refusals, rushed excuses, the clear message that he was no longer welcome. His loss of status was meteoric. Without my money, he wasn't Matthew, the bon vivant, the popular guy with access to parties and luxury cars. He was just Matthew, a 28-year-old unemployed man with no prospects. The admiration of his peers, which he valued so highly, revealed itself for what it always was, a superficial interest in his wallet. Without it, he was invisible, a social pariah. His cell phone, once a constant stream of invitations and messages, fell silent. The family isolation was just as swift. I informed my brothers and my closest nephews of what had happened, not to slander my son, but to warn them. I asked them not to offer him financial assistance, explaining that it was part of a larger, necessary recovery process. Though shocked, they understood and respected my decision. When Matthew tried to turn to them, he found only words of sympathy, but no offers of lodging or money. The family safety net had been deliberately removed by me. The final humiliation came when he had to seek refuge in a cheap room in a boarding house in a less than desirable part of the city. A grim place, smelling of mildew and desperation. The contrast with his spacious room in my house, with its king-size bed and private bathroom, must have been brutal. The reality of his new condition began to set in, not as a nightmare he would wake up from, but as his new, permanent existence. The luxury he considered a birthright had been replaced by the harsh struggle for daily survival. His world wasn't just crumbling, it was already in ruins. The fall was swift. public among those whose opinion he valued, and complete. He was stripped of money, status, friends, and family. His identity, so intertwined with the privileges I provided, had been stripped to the bone. For the first time in his life, Matthew Vance was completely alone, forced to look at the man in the mirror and confront the fact that the person he could blame most for his situation was himself. In that void, in that deafening silence of his isolation, the seed of redemption would have to find soil, however rocky, to germinate. He was at the bottom of a well he had dug himself with his choices. Now, he had only two options: let himself drown in the darkness or begin the difficult, painful climb back to the light. A climb he would have to make with his own two hands, without anyone's help. My part was done. The phase of direct consequences was over. Now the long and uncertain journey of his transformation began. For my part, began my own process of renewal. I put the house on the market that same week. That place, once a home full of happy memories, had become the scene of a betrayal, and its walls seemed to hold the echoes of lies and deceit. I needed a fresh start, far from the shadows of the past. Selling the house would be the final act of closure on this dark chapter of my life. And the capital I needed to build a more serene future. A future where my peace of mind would be my most valuable asset. The justice I imposed brought me no joy, but a sense of restored order. It was not an act of revenge, but of rebalancing. As an engineer, I knew that a structure with compromised foundations is doomed to collapse. My son's life was that structure. By forcing its demolition, I wasn't destroying him. I was giving him the only chance he would ever have to one day rebuild something solid, something true, something that was unequivocally his. And that was a hope worth going through all that pain for. For Matthew, hitting rock bottom wasn't a metaphor. It was a damp room in a cheap boarding house with peeling wallpaper and a single window overlooking a trash-filled alley. His new reality was a sensory assault on everything he had ever known. The smell of mildew replaced the aroma of my morning coffee, and the sound of distant sirens replaced the quiet tranquility of the suburbs. For the first time in his life, he faced the cold, hard indifference of the world. No one owed him anything. His last name, which once opened doors, was now just a word on a rental application he could barely afford. His first week of freedom was, in reality, his first week of true imprisonment, caged by the walls of his own incompetence. The job search was an even more brutal lesson in humility. Without a completed college degree and no real work experience, his resume was a blank page. The doors of the companies where his friends worked with help from their parents were firmly shut to him. After dozens of rejections, his arrogance was corroded by desperation. He finally accepted the only job he could find, an assistant at a mechanic shop on the outskirts of the city. It was dirty, physically demanding work that paid him little more than minimum wage. The young man who had refused to get his hands dirty to tend to his own garden was now submerged in grease and motor oil from 8 in the morning until 6 at night. The first few months were hell for him, as I later learned from the concise reports his therapist sent to my lawyer. His body, unaccustomed to physical labor, ached constantly. His co-workers, rough, straightforward men, had no patience for his dethroned prince attitude. They mocked his lack of skill, his weakness. Every day was a battle against his own ego, a struggle to swallow his pride and just do as he was told. His first paycheck after deducting rent and the first installment on his $150,000 debt barely left him enough for food. The life of luxury he had considered his birthright transformed into a daily struggle for basic necessities. The mandatory therapy sessions began as a farce. Matthew saw them as just another punishment, another humiliation imposed by me. In the first few weeks, he was hostile, sarcastic, and defensive. He blamed me for his situation, calling me a cruel and vengeful old man. He blamed Sophia for abandoning him. He blamed society, bad luck, the universe. He painted himself as a victim of circumstance, a misunderstood son whose only mistake was wanting a little freedom. The therapist, an experienced man, listened patiently, never contradicting him, but asking simple questions that subtly undermined his narrative of self-pity. And what part of the situation was under your control, Matthew? The psychological transformation was a slow and painful process, like recovering from a compound fracture. There was no sudden moment of epiphany, but a gradual erosion of his defenses. The harshness of his daily work began to have an unexpected effect. The extreme physical exhaustion left him no energy for his complex anger. His hands, now calloused and grimy, were a constant reminder of the value of honest work. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his perspective began to shift. The world was no longer a stage for his desires, but a system of cause and effect in which he was finally an active participant. He began to see his co-workers in a new light. Men he had initially scorned turned out to be dedicated family men, laborers who found dignity in their craft. He saw them celebrate small victories, like fixing a complicated engine or being able to take their kids to the park on the weekend. They were simple, authentic joys that contrasted sharply with the empty, fleeting pleasure he got from buying a new gadget or dining at an expensive restaurant. He was witnessing a kind of wealth my money could never buy, and that realization began to create cracks in the foundations of his value system. The change in his therapy sessions was notable. His hostility gave way to a sullen reticence, which in turn transformed into curiosity. He began to talk less about the injustices he had suffered and more about the difficulties of his day-to-day life. He started describing his job, the interactions with his colleagues, the anxiety of making his money last until the end of the month. Without realizing it, he was ceasing to see himself as the protagonist of a grand drama and beginning to see himself as an ordinary man dealing with ordinary problems. The therapist gently guided him through this new perspective, helping him connect his present feelings with his past choices. The moment of clarity, when it finally came, was not dramatic. It was quiet and devastating. One Saturday afternoon, he was working under a car, struggling with a rusted bolt. His boss, a man named Rick, came over and, without a word, showed him a different technique, using a specific tool that made the task instantly easier. "Work smarter, not harder, kid," Rick said, giving him a friendly pat on the shoulder before walking away. In that simple gesture, in that small lesson, something inside Matthew broke. He lay there under the car, staring at the oil-stained chassis, and for the first time he understood. He understood that his entire life he had chosen the harder path, the path of brute force, of demands, of lies. He had tried to force the world to give him what he wanted, instead of learning to work with it. My no to the request for the Mercedes keys hadn't been an act of cruelty. It had been an invitation for him to learn to use his own tools. And his response had been to burn the car, the equivalent of breaking the tool, because he didn't know how to use it. The sheer scale of his own stupidity, of his immaturity, crashed down on him. It was the first time he cried, not from anger or self-pity, but from a deep, overwhelming remorse. The therapist's report the following week described it as a turning point. Matthew arrived at the session and, for the first time, said the words that are the beginning of any genuine healing. "It was my fault. All of it. It was all my fault." He finally understood that the consequences he was suffering were not my revenge, but the just and inevitable harvest of the seeds he himself had sown. His anger toward me dissipated, replaced by a crushing shame. From that point on, genuine growth began. His motivation fundamentally changed. He stopped seeing the work at the shop as a punishment and started seeing it as an opportunity. He began to ask questions, to learn the names of parts, to take an interest in the mechanics of engines. Rick, his boss, noticed the change and began to teach him the trade in earnest. Matthew discovered he had a natural aptitude for solving mechanical problems, an ironic inheritance from the engineering mind of the father he had so despised. The monthly payment of his debt also took on a new meaning. It was no longer a burden imposed by me, but an act of reparation. He was imposing on himself. It was his way of slowly, piece by piece, rebuilding his integrity. Every bank transfer was an acknowledgement of his mistake and a step toward a future where he owed nothing to anyone, except the duty to himself to be a better man. He began to feel a strange kind of pride, not in having money, but in being able to meet his obligations, however difficult they were. He learned the value of humility. He learned to say, "I don't know, can you show me?" He learned to accept constructive criticism without feeling attacked. He learned to find satisfaction in a job well done, no matter how small. His old life, with its empty luxuries and superficial friendships, began to seem distant and strange, like a movie about someone else. He didn't miss it. For the first time, he was building something that was truly his, a skill set, a sense of responsibility, and a glimmer of self-respect. His transformation didn't make him a perfect person. He still had his bad days, moments of frustration and longing for an easier life. But the difference was that now he knew how to deal with them. He no longer resorted to blame or anger, but to the resilience he was developing. Suffering had been his greatest teacher, stripping him of everything that was false and forcing him to find his true strength. A strength that came not from money or status, but from character. His isolation, once a source of anguish, became a space for introspection. He started reading books from the public library, taking long walks, thinking about the kind of man he wanted to be. The silence that once terrified him became his ally. He was learning to enjoy his own company, to find peace in simplicity. He no longer needed the constant validation of others because he was, slowly, learning to validate himself. He did not seek to reclaim his old life. He knew that door was closed forever, and he was grateful for it. His goal was no longer to impress others or live a life of leisure. His new goal was simpler and infinitely more difficult: to be a good man, to be someone who could be trusted, to be someone who contributed more than he consumed. It was a modest ambition, but for the Matthew I had known, it was a complete revolution. In one of the last reports I received, the therapist shared a small anecdote. Matthew had used his little extra money to buy a set of used tools. He was fixing small appliances for his neighbors at the boarding house for free, just for the practice and the pleasure of fixing what was broken. That act, so small and so significant, told me everything I needed to know. My son, the destroyer, was becoming a builder. He was learning the value of respect, something that had always been given to him and which he had never returned. Respect for work, respect for money, respect for others, and most importantly, respect for himself. The path I had forced him down had been brutal, but it had led him to a destination he never would have found on his own. He was redeeming himself, not in my eyes, but in his own, which was the only thing that truly mattered. His redemption was not a miracle, but the logical result of the application of consequences. It was proof that sometimes the greatest demonstration of fatherly love is not to protect a child from the fall, but to ensure they feel the full impact of the ground. Only then can they learn the importance of standing on their own feet. And Matthew finally was learning to stand on his own two legs, on ground that for the first time in his life was solid. I sold the house and moved, as I had planned. The physical distance was necessary for both of us. For him, so he could grow without my shadow. For me, so I could heal from the wound of his betrayal. We had no contact during this period. His journey had to be his own, and my peace of mind depended on giving him that space. I trusted the process I had set in motion, a mechanism of justice and rehabilitation that now operated on its own. The anger I had initially felt had transformed into a kind of melancholy hope that my son would find his way, however tortuous. My drastic action had not been an act of rejection, but a last desperate investment in his character. And against all odds, it seemed the investment was finally beginning to pay off. His journey was far from over, but he had survived the bottom of the well and begun his climb. His new life, built on the rubble of the old, promised to be smaller, humbler, but infinitely more authentic. And in that authenticity, I hoped he would find not happiness, which is always fleeting, but something far more durable: peace. The process of his redemption was also, in a way, my own. By forcing him to confront his own darkness, I also had to confront my own failures as a father. My excessive generosity, my refusal to set boundaries sooner, all of it contributed to the creation of the monster he had become. His rehabilitation was also the absolution for my mistakes. The proof that it is never too late to do the right thing, no matter how painful. That angry, selfish boy who had set fire to a car out of spite was slowly disappearing, being replaced by a man who understood the weight of his actions. He was learning that life doesn't give us what we want, but what we deserve based on our work and our character. And that is the most valuable lesson a father can hope his son learns, no matter how devastating the cost of the class. 2 years passed. Time, with its slow and inexorable march, has the power to soften the sharpest edges of pain and transform ruins into foundations. I found my sanctuary in a smaller apartment with a balcony overlooking the sea. The salt breeze and the constant sound of the waves became the soundtrack to my new life, a life of deliberate simplicity. I sold my share in the sailboat and bought a smaller one that I can handle alone. I dedicated myself to hobbies that the corporate life had stolen from me: fishing, reading, and long walks on the beach at dawn. The peace I sought was not in the absence of problems, but in the serenity of knowing I had done the right thing, however hard it had been. My legacy, I realized, was not in the buildings I built, but in the order I restored. I moved on, not forgetting the past, but refusing to be its prisoner. My life became richer, not in material goods, but in experiences and tranquility. I found a serene happiness, the happiness of a man at peace with his decisions, no longer carrying the burden of a toxic relationship. My home was no longer a stage for lies, but a refuge of truth, a place where my soul could finally rest and recover from the long battle I had fought. As for Matthew, his new life also found a humble stability. I learned that he was still working at the same mechanic shop. His boss, Rick, had promoted him to lead mechanic. He had become good at his trade, respected for his skill and work ethic. He moved out of the grim boarding house and into a small rental apartment, a clean and simple space he maintained with his own sweat. His transformation had not been a fleeting miracle. It had been a structural change, forged in the fire of adversity and solidified by the routine of honest work and responsibility. He fulfilled his financial obligation religiously. Every month, without fail, a portion of his salary was transferred to the trust fund. It was a modest but constant amount, a perpetual reminder of his mistake and his commitment to repair it. About a month ago, I received a notification from Dr. Evans. The $150,000 debt had been paid in full. It took him 2 years of hard work and frugal living, but he paid back every cent. In doing so, he did not buy my forgiveness, but earned something far more valuable: his own dignity. The resolution between us was bittersweet, marked by a respectful distance. There was no tearful reunion, no embrace of reconciliation. The father-son relationship as it once existed was dead and buried under the ashes of the Mercedes. What remained was something different, more sober, a silent acknowledgement that we had both changed, each following our own path. A father's love never dies, but trust, once broken so fundamentally, can rarely be fully restored. The day he made the final payment, he sent me an email. It was the first direct communication we'd had in 2 years. The email contained only 4 words: "The debt is paid." There was no plea for forgiveness, no attempt at justification, just a simple factual acknowledgement. I replied in kind. "Received. I wish you the best, Arthur." And that was all. In that brief, formal exchange, there was a mutual understanding. The true resolution was not in recovering what was lost, but in accepting what each of us had become. His peace, like mine, was found in the acceptance of reality. He found dignity not in wealth, but in work. He found value not in what he owned, but in what he was able to build with his own hands. He did not reclaim the life of luxury, nor did he try. Instead, he built a smaller but solid life, a life that belonged to him in a way the previous one never had. And in that new reality, I hope he has found his own kind of peace. Our family's story is a lesson in justice and consequences. It teaches that true strength lies not in ignoring offenses, but in confronting them with courage and clarity. Justice at times demands that we be tough, not for revenge, but to protect and to teach. Forcing my son to face the consequences of his actions was the hardest and truest act of love I ever gave him. It was a love that stripped him of everything to allow him to find himself. We learned that a person's true worth is not measured by their bank account, their social status, or the assets they accumulate. True worth lies in character, integrity, and the ability to take responsibility for one's own choices. Matthew lost a fortune, but in the process, he found the beginnings of a character. And that is an exchange that in the long run will make him a far richer man than he ever would have been. Our legacy in the end is proof that even from the ashes of the deepest betrayal, something new and honest can be born. Not a restored relationship, perhaps, but two individuals who grew and found peace on their separate paths. Restorative justice does not erase the past, but it allows for a different future, a future where lessons have been learned and order has been finally re-established. And that is a conclusion worth fighting for. My story is not a tragedy, nor is it a tale of revenge. It is a story of rebirth. The rebirth of a father who learned to place principles above emotional comfort, and the rebirth of a son who was forced to destroy his life in order to finally start living it for real. And that is the only moral that matters. If you like this story, support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your opinions in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box that appears on the screen. Thank you for joining us.